I just want to start by thanking everyone and to let you know, in case you missed it, this is a recorded town hall, and we will also have captioning available. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Stephanie Page. I am the ARC Network's Community Engagement Manager. Thank you all for joining us for our town hall to discuss ensuring equity and institutional COVID-19 responses. Last June, we hosted the first town hall on ensuring equity and followed with a webinar series to provide resources and space for ongoing discussion around some of the issues and challenges the community shared during the first town hall. Now that we have spent over a year in the pandemic, including another academic year, we want to hear from you on how institutions have done in advancing equity in the time of COVID-19, what the new and ongoing issues and challenges are for integrating equity, what practices seem to be working, and what new research and methodologies have arisen to address this critical issue. To give you an overview of today's town hall, we are going to just give you a brief Zoom review, talk to you just a little bit about the ARC network, and we'll also be welcoming WePan, our home organization, to welcome you. We'll go over very briefly the impetus for this town hall and what brings us here today. We will share our ground rules for today's discussion, and then we will jump right in. Live captioning, as I mentioned, is provided by Carla Ray with Interpreter Now. If you are interested in their services, please visit interpreter-now.com. As a short introduction to our webinar platform, Zoom, I'd like to point out a couple of useful features. If you hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom window, you'll see a number of different menu options. To the right is the icon for captioning. Selecting the caret will allow you to customize your captioning. In the center are options for Q&A, chat, and raise hand. We have placed everyone on mute and ask that if you have any questions about Zoom or you experience any technical difficulties, please use the chat function to let us know. The chat will also serve as a space for discussions throughout the session. Please use the raise hand feature if you'd like to speak. We will be providing speaking space for 1 or 2 speakers among the attendees during each discussion prompt. Because ongoing conversations about academic decision-making are centered on predominantly white Research One institutions, we'll be balancing this discussion in a few ways. In the speaking opportunities, we'll be prioritizing attendees who study or work at minority-serving institutions, those who experience multiple dimensions of marginalization, and those for whom speaking their perspectives provides greater accessibility than typing. Please let us know if you identify in these ways in the chat if you wish to speak. We will also use the chat to share links to resources, and we encourage you to do the same. We'll be using the Q&A in a different way today. We ask that you post your response to prompts in the Q&A. And if another attendee's response resonates with you, please upvote it. And I will now hand the mic to Heather for the next portion.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm Dr. Heather Metcalf, the Principal Investigator for the ARC Network and WePan's Director of Research and Constituent Relations. As the STEM Equity Brain Trust, the ARC Network works to promote systemic change by collecting previous work and producing new perspectives, methods, and interventions through convenings, a curated resource library, emerging research workshops, a virtual visiting scholar program, and online events like this one. The ARC Network is funded by the National Science Foundation's Advance program, and the Women in Engineering Proactive Network serves as our home organization. To learn more about the ARC Network, we encourage you to visit equityinstem.org, where you can join the community if you haven't already. We are also very excited to welcome our ARC Network new team leaders, Virginia Rhodes and Ashley Garcia, who started with us just this week. And we will welcome another team member, Elizabeth Sheree, later this month. Now I will turn it over to Ursula Sims, who will offer a welcome from WePan.
Thank you, Heather. Hello, everyone, and thank you again for joining us today. I'm Dr. Ursula Sims, the Executive Director of the Women in Engineering Proactive Network, and also one of the co-PIs on the Advanced Resource and Coordination Network. WePan's mission is to advance cultures of inclusion and diversity in engineering, education, and the professions. And we aim to achieve our mission by empowering people and organizations who are catalysts for change, ensuring the success of women in engineering education and the professions, sustaining a strong network, creating research-based evidence, driving successful implementation of proven practices, and developing useful and timely resources. Since its inception, WePan has worked with institutions of higher education, corporations, and engineering societies to develop and implement research-based practices. One of WePan's strengths is its focus on establishing and sustaining partnerships and collaborations that are designed to ensure that all of WePan activities and initiatives have a broad and enduring impact at the individual and the institutional level. Another strength is professional development that we offer through webinars, workshops, program days, and annual meetings that equips advocates with the tools to create sustainable systems level changes that allow all to thrive. In February of this year, WePan became the new home of the ARC network. I was delighted when this took place because the alignment and synergy between WePan and the ARC network makes me even more hopeful in our ability to be able to reach systemic equity in STEM. The work that the ARC network does to promote systemic change to address gender equity in the STEM professoriate through the lens of intersectionality, intentionality, and inclusivity further helps WePan to achieve its mission. Before we get started, we would like to take a moment to set the tone with some of the background on last year's town hall and the impetus for this year's town hall. Last year, over 600 people registered for the ARC Network Town Hall on ensuring equity. Taking place just 1 week after the murder of George Floyd, folks were engaging with one another in the midst of immeasurable grief over the continued murders of Black people at the hands of law enforcement. While we recently witnessed one of the officers responsible for George Floyd's death held accountable, Black lives are still being cut short at the hands of law enforcement. The ARC network centers on values of intentionality, intersectionality, and inclusivity. We acknowledge openly that our work is social justice and that it is inextricably tied to justice far beyond the scope of intersectional gender equity in the STEM Academy. This year's town hall picks up and continues on the momentum of last year as we frame the impetus for today. I will now turn it over to Dr. Stephanie Page to discuss the impetus for this year's meeting.
Thank you so much, Ursula. One of the simplest definitions of inequity calls it a lack of justice. Inequity takes many different forms and includes contexts of race, ethnicity, gender identity, disability, sexuality, and so much more. And that is before we think how each of these contexts intertwine in complicated ways to shape experiences, opportunities, and oppression. Because of this, we know that there is no gender equity without simultaneously facing all dimensions of oppression. In our work on gender equity, we know all too well that those living with additional dimensions of systemic marginalization are often diminished, if not made invisible, by our approaches. We know that despite the best intentions, those most empowered in the decision-making processes at our institutions do not reflect those most impacted by injustice. Especially in times of crises, the distance from the varied lived experiences of inequity necessitates external push and support in ensuring equity is integrated into decision-making processes. Another year has passed, and we are still in unprecedented times as we coalesce community to look back, to review and assess the challenges and issues that remain, share ideas and resources, and elevate those unacknowledged voices as we continue the drive toward equity. This town hall comes after another year of continued witness of the disparate impacts of COVID-19 on Black, Latino, Pacific Islander, and Indigenous folk. We are here after another year of continued witness as voices of disabled and LGBTQ plus folk, particularly those of color, go largely ignored in addressing life and death circumstances exacerbated by this pandemic. And even more so, as legislative and judicial bodies across the country work to further diminish their rights. Another year has passed of continued violence in word and deed against Asian and Asian American folk for a racist and xenophobic misassignment of blame. During last year's town hall, we mourned over 100,000 deaths attributed to COVID-19. That number grew sixfold over the following year. These inequities are only a handful of examples. I'll turn it over to Heather.
Thank you, Stephanie. While we're meeting today together virtually in the context of a global pandemic, we must acknowledge that the majority of us are attending today's town hall from homes and workplaces that are located on Indigenous land. As land acknowledgements grow in popularity at academic convenings, it's important to remember that we occupy Indigenous land on a daily basis. Our land grant institutions, for example, are built on a foundation of expropriated Indigenous land. Please take a moment to honor with gratitude the land you're on itself and the people who lived and still live there and care for it. After the town hall, take time to learn about the history of the land in which you live and breathe, the Indigenous peoples connected to it, and the impact that history has on current Native communities, particularly during this pandemic. Support Native communities who, because of the ongoing legacy of colonization, genocide, forced removal, ethnic cleansing, scientific experimentation, and stolen land, disproportionately suffer during the COVID-19 pandemic. Learn about the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit movement to end gendered violence against Native peoples. Deepen your understanding of how these issues impact the Native faculty, staff, and students at your colleges and universities, and serve as a well-informed ally, colleague, leader, mentor, teacher, and more. Let's pause for a moment of acknowledgement of the land that we're currently on. There is no easy transition for describing the format of the town hall, but we hope this introduction has emphasized how critical equity is to decision-making, especially during times of crisis. I'll pass it over to Stephanie now, who will describe the primary goals of this town hall.
The primary goals of our town hall today are to discuss issues and challenges remaining or revealed at this stage of the pandemic, provide ARC Network resources focused on systemic STEM equity, to identify practices, tools, policy approaches, and research emerging in response to COVID-19 to support women in STEM and gender equity work in higher education, and also to identify people with expertise and bandwidth to present in the ongoing webinar series. Now we'll go over a few ground rules for today's conversation. The ground rules that we are using today have been developed by ARC Network community members over time, beginning with the ARC Network's inaugural stakeholder meeting, and being expanded and refined through ARC's emerging research workshops and biannual equity and STEM community convening. You can see the convening code of conduct on the ARC website should you wish to adopt a similar code for your own meeting. First, when first speaking, please introduce yourself briefly. Aim for honesty, depth, and brevity. Share personal experiences and link them back to the systemic issues we're addressing. Listen for understanding. Limit your own assumptions and ask clarifying questions as needed. Be respectful of and open to others' ideas and build on them where you can. There may be times when you need to challenge what another participant is saying. In this case, please be sure to phrase your remarks so that it is clear you are challenging the view, and not the person. There will be a range of emotions that come up in these conversations. These are valid. Be intentional with your actions in response to your own emotions and handle the emotions of others in the space with care. Be aware if you're dominating the conversation and invite others in to share the conversational space in the chat. We'll stop for a brief moment. If you have any additions, please place them in the Q&A. Okay. So as we begin to have our prompted portion of the discussion, I want to share a little bit of what we learned last year, and we learned a great deal. In last year's town hall, the issues and challenges that arose included communicating effectively across faculty, staff, and administrators, inclusive teaching strategies and student support, ensuring inclusivity without overburdening marginalized individuals, and advocacy strategies. We addressed some of these topics in our Fall Ensuring Equity webinar series, and we will be placing the links to the recordings of those webinars in the chat so that you can view those conversations, and we hope that you will join us in future webinars in the series. And now for today's discussion. We have 4 prompts, and we will go through each one by one, allowing time for discussion. As a reminder, please use the raise hand feature in Zoom if you would like to speak, and add your comments to each prompt to the Q&A, and remember to upvote. Okay, we have 1 raised hand, and so we will give 1 moment. I will go over this first prompt, and then I will acknowledge and bring forward that person. The first prompt is, what are the remaining challenges facing faculty in STEM during the pandemic? Heather, I saw 2 hands popped up. Do you know who was first?
Crystal Bedley. Crystal said she raised her hand mistakenly, so the next person who had their hand raised was Alicia Johnson.
Hi, Alicia, thank you. If you can, you should have permission through Zoom to speak now. You will have to unmute yourself.
She didn't mean to have her hand raised either. People are practicing using the tools here.
Okay, so
I know we're with a group of people who have lots of wonderful ideas, so I'm looking forward to comments coming in. Here we go. Thank you.
Margaret.
So we have, there we go, thank you.
My question or comment has to do with one of the important remaining challenges I think that we have is how to equitably and fairly evaluate faculty as they move through the pandemic and into the years in advance. And I'm interested in strategies that other programs are using. I'm the director of the advanced program at Clemson University, and we're developing equitable faculty evaluation workshops. So I'd like to hear what others are doing to try and address this issue of how to equitably evaluate faculty in response to the pandemic struggles that many have had.
That's such an important issue. You've seen a lot of conversations happen over the past year on the advanced listserv about this topic in particular, and some policy templates even that were shared that we can share out after the town hall here. Does anyone among our attendees have any work that they've done particularly in the area of equitable faculty evaluation that they'd like to share?
And while we're waiting for people to share on that, Stephanie Goodwin added that the 1-year tenure clock delay policies offered in the wake of the pandemic will not be enough to account for and accommodate the challenges that many faculty have faced and continue to face. So I wanted to make sure that was added. And then we had someone, an anonymous attendee share or ask, how can faculty appropriately share the impacts of COVID-19 on their professional lives, including how their personal lives were impacted in ways that intruded on their professional lives? Some schools are allowing impact statements, some are not, but including a statement will require them to share details that are very personal. So if you have also any input on more specific to those comments, and thank you, Stephanie, for sharing, and to our anonymous attendee for sharing.
I know one suggestion that came up over the past year related to promotion and tenure and the impacts of COVID on promotion and tenure have had to do with having those who are putting letters of support into P&T packets comment more openly about the impacts of COVID on faculty work life in general across all of the letters that they're writing, so that when there are gaps in productivity, some of this personal life stuff that people may not feel comfortable sharing in their own cover letters about what's happened over the past year, so they don't have to share some of those more revealing details that feel super vulnerable. I'm also seeing in the chat that Cynthia Warner shared that at Texas A&M they provided advice to department heads and saying admittedly that they still need to go further in providing guidance on what exactly to do with the impact statements. But there's a link in the chat for anyone who's interested in taking a look at that really great resource.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Cynthia. And we'll go ahead just in the essence of or in consideration of time and move to our second prompt. But please know that if we move on to another prompt, that does not mean that it's too late for you to continue sharing resources on a specific topic. We will be gathering what is shared through the chat. And we also have one hand up. So as Heather is looking at the next one, I'll invite that person in. Actually, it went away. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move. If the person who raised your hand, if you don't mind raising it again, but we'll definitely recognize you, but we'll go ahead and move to number 1, and I will reshare that so that all the panelists and attendees can see the link that was shared from Cynthia. So our second prompt, we want to know from you, what are new and emerging challenges facing faculty in STEM during the pandemic, particularly now that vaccines are available and many mask mandates and other mitigation mandates have been lifted?
I can start us while folks are thinking. So I know one of the concerns that's come up has been specifically centered around issues that faculty members with disabilities have experienced, and the concerns about some of the flexibility that's been gained during COVID-19 potentially going away in problematic ways that might disproportionately impact faculty with disabilities. It's one set of conversations that have been happening a lot, and if you're interested in learning more about those conversations and participating in them, the NSF Advance grant that's called Access Advance is centering around issues that women with disabilities among STEM faculty face and some systemic solutions to addressing those.
We have a raised hand from Marcy Levine, and so I'm going to invite you to talk, and you'll just have to unmute yourself.
All right,
Welcome.
can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right, another, and I agree, can we still be taking advantage of these accessible opportunities the pandemic has revealed are entirely possible. So thanks for mentioning that. And another thing that's come up is as we re-enter our campus spaces and aim to then regather in laboratories and things like that, people have been delaying bringing on new scholars and postdocs and folks like that. And so it's creating tension when there's a lag in the communication of what the campus reentry policy is going to be, as people need to get contracts and things lined up for new individuals. So it might look on paper that campus activities resume back to normal, but in reality, there's still going to be some kind of a lag with respect to the research ramp up. And a thought I had related to prompt 1, I know it ended, does relate to the research ramp up and Stephanie's comment, the tenure extensions not being enough. The research, where there's bridge funding or some other tools we have, is it appropriate? How do we appropriately and equitably recharge people's research during this gap? And so it connects with how do we reopen with people not knowing how to show up.
Such an important point. I know a lot of faculty members who, particularly those who work in labs, lost a lot of the headway that they had made throughout the pandemic as labs closed, and let's say they're dealing with biological life forms in their laboratories and weren't able to sustain those during this time period, and being able to have that open and transparent communication so they can plan accordingly is so important. And then the additional financial support that's necessary as folks rebuild. Thank you for raising that point, Marcy.
Yes, thank you so much. And we have a comment in the Q&A from Adam Smith, who says, some of the faculty I work with have raised the question of what to do if they have a student who refuses to wear a mask, even though the faculty has requested that masks be worn in their classrooms. There's a lot of concern whether or not they'll be protected or supported. Absolutely, and we'd love to hear more, particularly because this also represents an inconsistency, excuse me, from state to state in the realm of policy and even in legislation around mitigation practices, and how much can you enforce them in your classroom and laboratory, and even beyond that, what recourse do you have, and how much are you empowered as a faculty member if you feel like the safest option for yourself and the people you are responsible for is to be masked or to maintain other mitigation practices. We'd absolutely love to hear more.
We have another comment in the chat that says that at Clemson, they're trying to help faculty and staff with children too young to be immunized to navigate the safety of the classroom with unmasked students, which really relates to the discussion point that you just raised, Stephanie.
Absolutely, and we've heard so much in that context too about faculty members still needing to protect other people whether they're children or whether because of some condition they cannot be vaccinated. So that's also a concern that we're hearing. What I will also share is that there are some concerns too, where you might be in this place where some faculty are working at private institutions versus public, and the fact that oftentimes private institutions, their mandates tend to be more autonomous unless there is literally an executive order in that state, whereas state institutions are typically going to be more aligned with the government body and then what the contextual belief system is around whether to believe science or whether we are through with the pandemic, are we even still in a in a pandemic, and that has been of concern for a lot of faculty also in the context of, as you mentioned, protecting themselves, any children that they may be caring for or other family members they might share homes with or be caregivers for. So as I mentioned before, please continue to share comments and continue the discussion, even if we move on to another prompt. So for our third prompt, we actually want to know what you think institutions have done that have been effective on centering equity in response to COVID-19. And absolutely, if you have examples or resources or tools that might be of value to the rest of our community, please share those in the chat. And I will share briefly in connection to Heather's example and reality around what disabled faculty are experiencing. We're also interested to know what was introduced in response to COVID-19 that should be a prevailing accommodation or reality for faculty moving forward. We have one raised hand. Joy, give me one moment. I will give you permission to speak. Joya, are you there?
Sorry, I was just walking in. I wasn't trying to raise my hand.
We had a number of folks have that issue. If you change your mind and you have something you'd like to share, we can always invite you back up.
But I will say, Joya, if you don't mind, there were a couple of comments because of your extensive work on faculty workloads. Would you like to share, because there were some comments on our first two prompts in terms of how are, what are the remaining issues and challenges, how are faculty positioned looking at tenure and promotion and looking at upcoming evaluations? Is there anything that immediately kind of comes to mind in terms of what you've been finding in your work?
I'm a little bit, I just had a bunch of Novocaine in my mouth, so I'm going to sound a little strange. I'd be happy to share our findings, but I'm not sure specifically what would be most useful. I do really think that a lot of universities have focused on kind of the immediate and haven't been thinking out about how do we need to rethink how we do evaluation of faculty so that we don't end up becoming much less diverse institutions, because we know that this has been such a, the impact has been so much greater on women faculty of color, caregiving faculty, there's just a lot of there's a lot that needs to be considered. A lot of institutions have yet to really take that seriously. And, you know, I think that we've had some pieces in Inside Higher Education. One of them appeared last week, I think, that try to like walk institutions through. These are the steps we think you need to take. There's, you know, like there are certain things, the tree model that we have, there are certain things that we think are really important, but then there are the logistics of how do you actually center equity in these processes moving forward. And so hopefully that's helpful, but I'm happy to answer other questions.
Thank you so much, Joya. And I will share that Joya, along with Ethel Mickey and some other of the amazing people at UMass Amherst Advanced Program, have been gracious enough to share with us a collection of resources and tools. And we will be sharing that out as we close today's conversation. So keep an eye out for that. And we'll also send it out in our follow-up from this conversation. We do have a comment in the Q&A from Crystal Bedley, who says, there has been a greater focus on accessibility and ensuring meetings and events are accessible. For instance, it seems offering Zoom as an option to connect, even when meeting in person is possible. Learning more about best hybrid approaches would be helpful. We also had another comment from an anonymous attendee who says, equitable evaluation will necessarily require acknowledging that the impacts have been disparate and that people should not be penalized for the things that are beyond their control. Thank you, Crystal, and thank you to the anonymous attendee for those comments. We see that often in conversations, particularly Kimberly Griffin has talked a lot about this point about the expectation around productivity and what that really means in the context and how that impacts people disproportionately. And absolutely let us drop links in the chat if you have any resources on this topic that have been helpful for you. Okay, so we're going to move on to prompt 4. And with this prompt, we want to hear more about what we're learning from new research emerging related to faculty equity issues during COVID-19. And we understand that, you know, a lot of this is really burgeoning, but we know that the past year has been really interesting context to consider equity in STEM. So we'd be excited to hear about some new research questions that people are answering. I will share that a group at UCLA has actually been studying communications to institutions, whether from faculty or student body, throughout the pandemic, and particularly in the context of racial inequity, as more and more people have been vocal to their institutional decision makers regarding their stances on these critical issues, and the fact that a lot of these critical issues, because they went unaddressed, became exacerbated in the pandemic. So I'm really excited to hear what comes from that work with that group at UCLA. Margaret Potasic added, great suggestion by Joya's UMass Advanced Group. We plan to build our equitable faculty evaluation training workshops this fall for TPR and chairs. And if I'm remembering correctly, Margaret was someone who was just an exceptional resource when we were also dealing with the executive order limiting DEI trainings and practices. So I wanted to actually shout out Margaret for that work too.
I also just placed into the chat a link to the National Academy's report on the potential impact of COVID-19 on the careers of women in academic, science, engineering, and medicine. It's a really helpful report in thinking through what our institutions can be doing to mitigate any inequities that might be disproportionately impacting the careers of women. And I think if we put an intersectionality lens on it, we could also look at these from the perspective of how might other types of inequities enter into the picture as we think about other dimensions of marginalization that intersect with gender.
And I also want to share that we absolutely always must recognize our virtual visiting scholars for their work, and particularly this third cohort, which also includes Joya, because it is such an interesting time to study equity in STEM. And we will share more about our virtual visiting scholars program and what our current scholars are doing. As some of you may know, we will be introducing to you the fourth cohort this fall, so we are really excited to review those. But I wanted to highlight our virtual visiting scholars and the fact that they are doing such critical work, and to be in a pandemic, they have not shied away from thinking about the context of COVID and how that impacts marginalized faculty in STEM.
Stephanie, we have another hand up. I see you, Margaret, and I'll invite you back in here. There we go.
It's saying you should unmute. Can you test? Okay, great.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I was just gonna ask a question of the group. We are planning here at Clemson for our equitable faculty evaluation bias training workshops again this coming fall, with the lens on equitable evaluation in response to pandemic disruptions. And so what I'm going to work on this summer is actually writing mock impact statements, and then having breakout sessions in the training, the online or face-to-face training that we have, so that groups actually discuss some potential impact statements that they might be receiving from their faculty. So I was just wondering if anyone else has thought about doing this, if anybody has any suggestions on good resources for addressing impact statements. Anybody want to help me write any mock impact statements out there? But we're thinking this is going to be one of the best ways to get TPR committees and department chairs to start thinking and talking about how to address the impacts for individual faculty.
This is Joya. I totally agree with you, Margaret. And I think that this is like exactly the way to do it, is to have these evaluation committees start by looking at cases that we, pandemic impact statements that are not related to their actual colleagues, and talk about the principles. How do we do these assessments? How do we consider these? And then once they've been able to do that, and hopefully been sort of steered to do that in equitable ways, then they'll be prepared to actually do real evaluations, right? So I'm working on the same thing. I actually have, helped universities with that kind of, those kind of templates for creating these pandemic impact statements, and some case studies I've worked through with people. So I'd be happy to work with you a bit on it, Margaret. And I do think it's this is absolutely drawing from the way in which you have used case studies in the past to really try to make sure that we do this this training correctly in, in this context.
Thank you both. And if anyone else has anything to add, please raise your hand or comment in the chat or the Q&A. I wanted to highlight something that Cynthia Werner said in the chat, that one of the key equity issues relates to the type of appointment, contingent faculty versus tenure track or tenured faculty. Cynthia, not Stephanie, is leading a research project that is looking at differential impacts of COVID-19. And this is emerging as a key issue. We know COVID-19 is going to affect the pipeline for women faculty and faculty of color. Faculty in our study who are in non-tenure track positions are much more vulnerable, and many of them are intending to use these positions as a stepping stone to a tenure track or tenured faculty position. This is also a context of one of our virtual visiting scholars work, Dr. Ramon Going. So thank you so much, Cynthia, for sharing your work in that space. And Cynthia went on to add in another comment in the chat that she would be interested in working with you on mock impact statements. So I'm assuming that's to Margaret. They're working on a similar type of workshop. So, something's happening with the slides. I apologize for that. Did we see any other comments, Heather?
No, you have them covered.
Great. So just looking at timing and where we are, I'm going to just read the last few comments that we get in. This has been such a great conversation and important for us to hear. Please keep comments coming, though. Don't think that you have to stop as we're sort of transitioning a little bit. I will share that Crystal Bedley added to the Q&A. A COVID-related challenge to diversifying the faculty through inclusive practices is how to be equitable during the campus visit. Right now, my institution has search committees currently trying, sorry, I lost it, currently trying to determine whether they will have in-person, virtual, or a mix of the two. My gut is that a mix would be the least equitable. Would love to hear others' thoughts. And that was, again, Crystal Bedley. And also, please feel free, if there are questions or comments that we haven't covered, please share those with us. Even if our time today has ended, we will continue to consider these in terms of where resources are shared through our community, through the ARC network. And we'll also consider these questions as we continue to develop our webinar series on ensuring equity. Okay, so I'm just going to click through my slide deck that rebelled. Heather, was there anything that you wanted to add, just seeing some of the discussion pieces, or Ursula or any of our other team members?
I think one thing I just want to reiterate on that you mentioned, Stephanie, is that part of the impetus of this town hall is really to hear from you and some of the challenges that you're encountering and resources that you need to help support you as you're doing equity work. And so even beyond the town hall, if you're looking for example, we just heard about impact statements during this town hall today, and maybe getting some examples of how to frame an impact statement in a way that's equitable, that could lead to equitable outcomes. If you have questions like that and you're looking for a resource, feel free to send us a message after the town hall even, and we'll share back out anything that we have that's come up over the last year and resources that have been shared. And then if you happen to have a resource that you've used that you've found to be incredibly helpful as you navigated these kinds of challenges, please do share it with us so that we can help disseminate that to the broader community. I know a lot of folks are looking for support and resources as they navigate challenges and think about over the summer, what is it going to mean for a new semester to start in the fall? And what is that going to look like for faculty and for students?
Well, I want to thank you all so much for joining us. We are grateful that you made time today, and we are sure that your bandwidths are limited. And so we are just so appreciative of each and every time that we get to hear from you on critical issues on equity and STEM. We also acknowledge the labor and the vulnerability associated with these kinds of conversations. And again, we're so grateful that you've entrusted us to hear you in this space. As we close today's town hall, we will reshare the links that we shared in the chat. And we will also share a survey link where you can provide feedback and submit additional resources. We absolutely take seriously and value the input of you all in the work that we do. So if you have the time and the bandwidth, please complete our feedback survey. We also want to especially acknowledge Ethel Mickey, Joya Misra, and the rest of the UMass Amherst Advanced team for graciously sharing this incredible resource and tools document, which we have also shared with you today. And we look forward to sharing more with you in the near future. I'm saying that with great emphasis on some of the amazing things that are coming for us as the ARC network grows and progresses in our work toward equity and STEM. So I'll just do one more round of checking the chat, but I just absolutely want to thank you all for coming and for sharing and for participating with us today.
Stephanie, I did see that Cynthia Warner responded to the last question.
Oh, great.
The response was agreed, a mix is the least equitable. Given the pandemic is still ongoing and affecting international travel, it can be problematic to plan for in-person interviews. The possibility that some candidates might have valid reasons not to travel that they may not want to disclose. So that could also be an issue to assume that in-person interviews would work for domestic search.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you so much, Ursula. And thank you everyone for joining us. We are so grateful that you spent time with us today, and we hope to see you again in the very near future. Thank you.